Hi there. The following is a video explanation about ending the Civil War. So topics referring to total war and some of the facts and figures at the conclusion of the conflict. So if you recall, one of the things we talked about was the Union's use of total war tactics toward the end of the Civil War. A total war is a war that is completely unrestricted in terms of the weapons that someone uses, the objectives that they are pursuing, and where the laws of war are being disregarded. And the Union started pivoting toward these types of tactics toward the end of the Civil War because of this belief that using a total war would actually end the war faster. So if we can destroy not only the Confederate Army, but the South's ability to fight, then we can actually bring about the end of the war much faster. So generals like William Tecumseh Sherman, in his march to the capital of Georgia in Atlanta, the use of total war tactics in the Shenandoah Valley with Philip Sheridan. These are the types of things that the Union started using to bring about the war, the end of the war much faster. So the burning of Atlanta in 1864, Sherman's march to the sea, where they're just destroying cities and towns. They're setting fire to structures. They're destroying railroad tracks, mills and factories to try and prevent the Confederacy from having any way of putting an army in the field to be able to fight, to cripple their will to fight even. And in the North, they also started to draft soldiers. So the Conscription Act of 1863 started to require American citizens in the North to sign up for the draft so that they could be selected to fight. And so the Union started to use its power and its might not only to defeat the Confederates in battle, but to put together a larger army and to wipe out the Confederacy's ability to fight and their will to continue fighting this war. So by the time 1865 rolls around, Lincoln has been inaugurated for his second term as president, and Robert E. Lee is leading his last attempts, his last gasp efforts at continuing this fight. So he kind of leads in the spring of 1865 what's called his last offensive in Petersburg, Virginia. But by April 3rd, so about a week later, the Union Army has captured and is now occupying the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Remember, that was one of the goals of the Anaconda Plan. So now they have taken the Confederate capital. 6 days after that, Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. We'll see that a little more here in a second. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln is shot at Ford's Theater. And so the Civil War comes to an end unofficially when Robert E. Lee surrenders, but Lincoln being assassinated shortly thereafter is going to set the stage for a very chaotic decade or so after the Civil War. So when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, it essentially ended the war. There was really nothing left for the Confederacy to do but to give in and surrender. And one of the interesting things about the way that surrender was handled is that General Ulysses S. Grant was incredibly kind and generous toward the Confederates who were surrendering. He told his troops not to rejoice that they had defeated the Confederates standing before them, but that they should respect them and see them as their brothers now, that they are countrymen. Now that the Civil War is over, they are no longer Confederates versus Union. They are Americans again. And so he was incredibly generous in allowing these Confederate soldiers to go home in peace, to take their weapons and their property to head home. They even helped to feed some of the hungry and starving Confederate soldiers who had surrendered. So very generous peace terms that were offered by Ulysses S. Grant to his Confederate opponents. So a few statistics to look at as we wrap up the Civil War that are noteworthy. One is enlistment and conscription. So these two pie charts show just the numbers of soldiers that either volunteered to participate or were drafted into their respective armies. And you can see here that the Union Army was simply just much, much larger. So over 1.7 million soldiers volunteered to fight for the Union. That is far larger than the Confederate enlistment ever was. In terms of fatalities, the Union actually suffered more deaths during the Civil War, but that was not enough to cripple their ability to fight because, again, they just had a much larger army, both in terms of those who were conscripted and in terms of those who volunteered. Now, this chart here does not include the number of deaths or the numbers of wounded soldiers during the Civil War. So the total number of deaths is over 600,000. But when including other like wounded and missing soldiers, the total casualty list for the Civil War is somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 total men who died, wounded, missing as a result of the Civil War. And finally, just to drive again this point home about the strengths of the two sides, the military strength of the Union in blue here is just so much higher than the Confederacy. And so the outcome of the Civil War was almost inevitable, that the Union, just because of its size and strength, its ability to produce the things needed to fight a war, its railroads to be able to transport soldiers to and from battlefields, the Union was just much bigger and stronger and more powerful. And so as time wore on, eventually the Confederacy was worn down to the point that they could not continue the fight anymore. And by 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrenders, that's ultimately the end of the Civil War. I hope this helps you understand a little about total war tactics and some of the key facts and figures at the end of the Civil War. Thanks for watching.